Our channel shares stories that actually happened. Do you know or have experienced any shocking stories? We also tell the stories of our subscribers. Leave them in the comments so we can share them with the world. We want to hear from you. For years, Frank had lived with the shadow of an absence that seemed to follow him everywhere. His mother, Julia, had vanished when he was just a child, leaving behind a void that no one could fill. He grew up with his father's cold, emotionless explanations, never really knowing what happened to her. The pain of missing her never quite left, and the questions about why she left, why she disappeared, always haunted him. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what would unfold that day. It was a typical evening. Frank had just finished a grueling day at work and was heading home, exhausted. The tiredness from the day was weighing on him, and the quiet hum of the car as he drove was oddly soothing. As he glanced in his rearview mirror, his mind still foggy from the day's events, he saw something that would stop him in his tracks forever. A figure, no, a woman, darted out into the middle of the road out of nowhere. Frank slammed his foot onto the brakes, his heart jumping into his throat. The car swerved for a second as he tried to avoid hitting her. He could barely see her clearly, only noticing her standing there trembling, frozen in place as if paralyzed by the situation. She raised a shaky hand, almost as if she was apologizing for being in his way, but it wasn't the woman's sudden appearance or her apologies that made Frank's heart stop. It was the moment when the headlights of his car illuminated her face. The world seemed to freeze. It was her. The woman before him, standing in the middle of the road, was the spitting image of his mother. Frank felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't move. His mind raced. How could this be possible? His mother had been gone for 30 years. How could she be standing here right in front of him, looking like a stranger but still undeniably familiar? Frank couldn't believe what he was seeing. The woman's face, the same eyes, the same features, the same expression of fear and confusion. It all matched Julia's image from his childhood. But how could it be? His mother had vanished without a trace, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions and painful memories. She had been gone for 30 years, and now here she was, standing in front of him in the middle of the road, looking lost, vulnerable, and broken. Frank's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and a deep sense of fear. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped out of the car, unsure of what to do, unsure if he was imagining things or if this was real. The woman stood there, her body trembling, her hands shaking, her eyes empty. She muttered something under her breath, something that sent a chill through Frank's spine. "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." Frank froze. The words hit him like a punch in the gut. Lock her up again? What did she mean by that? Was this really his mother, or was he just imagining the resemblance? He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. But deep down, something in him told him that this was no coincidence. This woman, no matter how broken she seemed, looked too much like Julia for it to be a mistake. Frank felt his emotions rise: anger, sorrow, and a deep sense of betrayal. What had happened to his mother? Why was she here, in such a terrible state? How had she ended up on the streets, living in this sad and pathetic condition? The memories of his childhood flooded back. The nights he spent alone, asking his father about his mother, only to be met with cold indifference and lies. The years of unanswered questions, the trauma of not knowing where she had gone, why she had left. And now, after all this time, here she was, but in a form so different from the woman he remembered. With his heart heavy, Frank gently helped the woman into the car, his mind spinning with more questions than answers. He didn't know what to do or how to explain the whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her there. She seemed so fragile, her body shuddering with every breath, as if she were lost in a world of her own, unaware of her surroundings. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in a nightmare. As he drove, his thoughts tangled, each question leading to another. Was this really his mother? How could she have ended up like this? The woman barely said anything, her voice faint, barely above a whisper. and Frank felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had always wondered about his mother's disappearance, but he never imagined that one day he would find her under these circumstances. The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever. Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman sitting next to him. What had happened to her? Why had she disappeared all those years ago? Why hadn't she come looking for him? Why had no one ever told him the truth? As they approached the hospital, Frank's stomach tightened with anxiety. He was terrified of what might happen next, but he couldn't let her suffer any longer. They arrived at the emergency room, and Frank helped the woman inside, feeling a strange sense of urgency. The hospital was bustling with activity, but everything around him felt distant, as if the world had stopped moving. His mind was still racing, each thought colliding with the next. Was this really his mother? How could she have ended up like this? The questions pounded in his mind, relentless, and the silence between them only made them more suffocating. Frank didn't know how to process everything that had happened in such a short time. All he could do was hope that the hospital staff could provide the answers he so desperately needed. He needed to know what had happened to his mother, why she had been taken away, why she had disappeared. He couldn't keep living with this uncertainty. The pain of the past had come rushing back, but now he felt something new. Anger. Anger at the world, at his father, and at the helplessness that had kept him from finding his mother all these years. As he waited in the hospital, Frank's thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions: rage, sorrow, disbelief. But deep down, he knew that he was about to find out the truth. Whatever that truth was, he would have to face it, and somehow, he had to make sense of it all. As Frank sat in the sterile, cold waiting room, his thoughts became a blur of confusion and dread. The minutes felt like hours as he waited for the doctor to return. His hands were clammy, his heart still racing. The questions that had been tormenting him since that moment on the road, the overwhelming need to know what had happened to his mother, kept circling in his mind, pushing away any other thoughts. Why had she been gone for so long? Where had she been? What kind of life had she lived, and why was she in this state now? He couldn't stop replaying the image of her face, so familiar yet so distant, the eyes that had once been full of life now hollow and filled with fear. Frank had to know the truth. He couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. The weight of it all was crushing him. He kept thinking about his childhood, those years he spent growing up without his mother, the constant ache of wondering where she was, why she left. He had carried that pain for so long, never knowing what had happened to her. And now this woman, this person who looked like her, was standing in front of him. But she seemed so different. It wasn't just the physical changes that troubled him. It was the way she acted, her demeanor, the fear in her eyes. It was as if she had lived through something unimaginable, something that had left deep scars. Frank didn't know if he could take it. He had always wondered what happened to his mother, but now that the truth was so close, he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. He wasn't sure if he could bear to learn the truth about what she had endured, especially if it meant confronting his father. That thought alone made his blood run cold. His father. How could he not have known? How could he have kept this secret for so long? The more Frank thought about it, the angrier he became. He had spent all these years believing the lies, believing the stories his father had told him, and now to think that his own father could be responsible for what had happened to his mother, it was almost too much to bear. Frank knew that no matter how painful it was, he had to face this head-on. He had to find out what had happened to Julia, and why she had been treated like this. The doctor finally walked into the room, his expression serious, but there was a hint of sympathy in his eyes as he looked at Frank. "We've completed the preliminary tests," he said, his voice calm but with an air of concern. Frank's heart skipped a beat. The wait had felt like an eternity, and now the moment had come. He was about to get some answers, or at least he hoped so. "She's in very poor condition," the doctor continued, his words heavy with the weight of truth. "Severe malnutrition, extreme physical exhaustion, and signs of long-term abuse. She's been through a lot, Frank. We need to run some more tests to understand the full extent of her condition, but we also recommend a full psychological evaluation. Frank's mind was racing. Abuse, malnutrition. His mother had suffered for years. He didn't need the doctor to tell him that. He had seen it in her face, in the way she moved, in the fear that radiated from her. He had always wondered, but hearing the words out loud made it all the more real. His mother hadn't just disappeared. She had been trapped in a nightmare. Frank's thoughts turned to his father. What had he done to her? How could he have let this happen? The emotions boiled inside him, a mixture of anger and disbelief. He couldn't accept that the man who had raised him, the man he had trusted, was responsible for his mother's torment. The more the doctor spoke, the more Frank felt like he was losing control. He needed answers, but now, as the weight of the situation sank in, he realized that the answers might be even worse than he had feared. "We can run a DNA test if you want to confirm her identity," the doctor added, noticing Frank's tension. Frank nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The need for confirmation, the desperate need to know that this was truly his mother, was too strong to ignore. His heart was still racing, but he had made a decision. He would go through with the DNA test. He needed to know the truth. And then, maybe, just maybe, he could begin to understand the horrors of the past 30 years. The next day, Frank received the call he had been dreading, but at the same time, it was the moment he had been waiting for. His hands shook as he answered the phone, his heart in his throat. The doctor's voice came through the line, calm but definitive. "The DNA test confirmed it, Frank. She is Julia, your mother." The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. How could this be? How could she have been so close yet so far for all these years? His mother was alive, but she had been living a life he could never have imagined, a life filled with suffering, abuse, and isolation. Frank stood there in silence, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. He felt a surge of anger, a deep ache of sorrow, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal all at once. He had spent his entire life thinking his mother had abandoned him, that she had left without a trace, but the truth was so much darker than he could have ever imagined. His father, the man he had trusted, had locked his mother away in a psychiatric institution for reasons Frank couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was all so surreal. How had it all happened? Why had no one ever told him? And now, after all these years, he was finally learning the truth, but it was almost too much to bear. Frank couldn't stand the thought of the years his mother had suffered, and he couldn't understand how his father could have done such a thing. The more he thought about it, the more his anger grew. How could he have been so blind? How could he have believed the lies his father had fed him all these years? Frank's emotions were a storm inside him. Rage, heartbreak, disbelief. He needed answers. He needed to understand why his mother had been taken away, why she had been locked away in a mental institution and left to live in such pain. He couldn't stand the thought of it. He had to confront his father. He had to find out why. Frank's determination grew stronger with each passing hour. He couldn't let his mother's suffering be swept under the rug. He couldn't just sit idly by while his father, the man who had lied to him his entire life, got away with what he had done. Frank's mind was set. He had to confront Richard, his father. He had to find out the truth, even if it meant tearing apart everything he thought he knew about his family. Frank felt a burning need to uncover the reality of the past, to bring justice to the woman who had been wronged so terribly. He knew that confronting his father would be painful, that it would change everything. But he couldn't let his mother's agony remain a secret any longer. Frank gathered his thoughts, took a deep breath, and left the hospital. His hands were clammy and his heart was racing, but he knew he couldn't delay any longer. He went straight to his father's house, his steps heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. When he arrived, Richard was sitting in the living room reading the newspaper, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. Frank stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of the man he had once looked up to. Richard didn't even look up as Frank entered the room. It was as if nothing had changed, as if this was just another day. But Frank knew that nothing would ever be the same again. "Dad," Frank's voice was firm, though it trembled with anger. What did you do to Mom? Richard slowly lowered the newspaper, meeting his son's gaze for the first time. There was no surprise, no emotion in his eyes, just cold indifference. Richard didn't flinch. She was weak, he replied, his voice calm as if discussing something trivial. She couldn't meet my demands and she wasn't strong enough to be my wife. I needed someone who could help me advance and she just couldn't. Frank stood frozen, every word like a slap to his face. How could he have said that? How could he speak about his mother that way? Frank's blood was boiling, and he could feel the rage building inside him. His mother, the woman he had spent years missing, the woman he had been told had abandoned him, had been discarded by his father because she wasn't good enough. His heart was breaking all over again, but this time, the anger was more intense than the sorrow. Frank couldn't understand how his father, the man he had trusted, could be so cruel. How could he lock his wife away for 30 years, treating her like a prisoner? Frank's body trembled with fury, but he knew he had to stay calm. He needed answers, even if it meant confronting the unbearable truth. The confrontation with his father felt like a knife twisting in Frank's chest. The anger inside him surged, threatening to consume him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You destroyed our family," Frank said, his voice trembling with the weight of the words. "You took her away. You locked her up for 30 years, and you made me believe she had just abandoned us. Why? Why did you do this?" Richard's eyes remained cold, his expression unchanging, almost as if he were unaffected by the pain he had caused. "I did what was necessary for our future," he replied, his voice still devoid of any remorse. "She wasn't strong enough. She was too weak to handle the pressure. I needed someone who could help me build my career, someone strong enough to keep up with me. She couldn't do that." Frank's heart shattered hearing those words. He had spent so many years asking himself why his mother was gone, and now he had the answer. But it was a truth that felt unbearable. His father, the man who had raised him, the man he had trusted, had abandoned his own wife and kept her locked away for decades, all because she was too weak. Frank's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body shaking with rage. He could feel the betrayal coursing through him, every fiber of his being screaming in disbelief. How could Richard say something like that? How could he justify this cruelty? Frank had always looked up to his father, had always admired him, but now everything had changed. The man Frank had once called a role model was nothing more than a cold-hearted tyrant. Frank knew then that he couldn't keep living in the shadow of his father's lies. He had to make things right for his mother. He couldn't let this go. He would do whatever it took to bring justice to the woman who had been wronged for so long. Frank stood up, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth, but also with a new sense of resolve. He wasn't going to let his father's cruelty define him anymore. He had to fight for his mother, for the woman who had been forgotten for far too long. The days after confronting his father were filled with a mix of relief and overwhelming emotion. Frank couldn't escape the heaviness in his chest. The weight of the truth now settled deep within him. His mind was constantly replaying that conversation, the coldness in his father's eyes, and the words that cut deeper than anything he had ever imagined. But despite the pain, Frank knew he had done what was necessary. He couldn't let his father's lies and cruelty go unpunished. So, he made the decision to take action. Frank contacted a lawyer, someone who specialized in cases like this, and together, they began to gather evidence. The hospital records, the testimonies from former staff members who had worked at the psychiatric institution where his mother had been held, everything pointed to the same truth. Julia had been committed without her consent, forced to live in a nightmare for decades. Frank's emotions were a whirlwind of anger and sorrow as they worked through the legal process. Each piece of evidence brought him closer to the day when Richard would have to face the consequences of his actions. But no matter how much progress they made, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his father would somehow escape punishment. The thought haunted him. After everything that had happened, after all the years of suffering, he couldn't bear the idea of his father getting away with it. And so, Frank pushed forward, relentlessly pursuing justice for his mother. As the trial date approached, The pressure mounted. The media had caught wind of the case and public outrage began to grow. Richard's reputation, once untouchable, was slowly crumbling. People who had once admired him now began to question his actions. Frank could feel the eyes of the world on him, but it didn't matter. He knew this was bigger than just his family. This was about bringing the truth to light, about ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The day of the trial arrived and Frank sat in the courtroom, his heart heavy with a mix of anticipation and dread. He had spent so long preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, seeking justice. But now that it was finally here, he wasn't sure what to feel. His mother sat beside him, her face pale but determined. She had agreed to come, to face the truth, to finally stand up for herself after all these years. Frank could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the past bearing down on everyone present. The courtroom was filled with people, reporters and onlookers, all waiting to hear what would unfold. Richard sat across the room, looking as cold and distant as ever. He showed no sign of remorse, no sign of understanding the pain he had caused. But Frank didn't need his father's apology. He didn't need anything from him. What he needed was for the truth to be acknowledged, for the world to know what had really happened. As the trial began, Frank listened to the testimonies, to the witnesses who spoke about what they had seen, about the years his mother had spent locked away, isolated and abused. The evidence was irrefutable. Richard had committed his mother to the psychiatric institution against her will, keeping her there for 30 years. The courtroom grew silent as the verdict was read. Richard was found guilty of unlawful deprivation of liberty and cruel treatment toward his wife. Frank's heart pounded as he heard the words, but a sense of relief washed over him. Justice had been served. His father would face the consequences of his actions. As Frank and his mother left the courtroom, hand in hand, a quiet peace settled over them. They had fought for this moment, and now, it was finally over. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be healing to do, still wounds to mend, but they had taken the first step toward rebuilding their lives. For the first time in years, Frank could breathe again. His mother was free. They were free. And together, they would face the future, leaving the past behind them.